Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry, slightly echoey microphone, but after a few minutes you get used to it. So welcome. This is fantastic that we've got the full lecture theatre tonight. I just want to do a very short introduction before I pass over to our chair. First of all, introduce myself. My name's Mel Dodd and I am the Programme Director of Spatial Practice. Most of you know me because we have a large audience of our own students and staff, which is great, but we also have an audience that consists of external guests who've come, so welcome to you all, and it's great to see you. We usually open up our lecture series to an external audience, but this series has been incredibly popular and hence why we've doubled our capacity, so it's great to know that that's been somehow the zeitgeist of this series has somehow really worked. Just to give you a little bit of backdrop, we curate a lecture series every term. It's basically trying to ask questions that we're interested in terms of our programs, which are BA and MA Architecture and MA Narrative Environments, questioning aspects of spatial practice, looking at practices that are at the edges and boundaries of architecture and looking at the social and political context of the city. So last year we asked Ollie to do a lecture for us that was incredibly popular and really was a catalyst for a lot of students' work in terms of asking questions about the contemporary condition of London and the forces which are bearing down upon it and creating issues of social injustice. And in a way, that series has come out of that first lecture, so that was very fruitful. We asked Ollie if he would like to, in his role as a sort of critical writer and journalist and a sort of overview of forces in London, to contribute to the lecture series, and he very kindly agreed, and this is what we have today. So this is the first lecture. It's actually a debate series, so we have a fantastic array of guests. He's going to introduce them. It's the beginning of a series that's running every Thursday night from 6:30. Every night will be in this size venue. We're sold out in terms of external tickets, so it's fantastic, but we can still fit some more people in, and we'll hope that we can do that in the next few weeks. So probably that's enough from me. Thanks very much for coming. Prepare yourself to contribute to the conversation. The speakers will speak and Ollie will introduce the format of the evening, but it's very much about you joining into the conversation. So we have mics, and for the latter part of the debate, that will involve you as an audience. So please contribute and prepare and think about that. And so I will hand over to Ollie and say thank you very much. Great, and on to the next.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to see such a good turnout for the first debate in this six-part series. I should start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. It's quite a rare place, given that it's an architecture school in London which actually engages with reality. It's a place where students are actually looking at planning policy, at the kind of invisible forces that are shaping architecture rather than necessarily just the formal pursuit of architecture itself. And I guess it's something that I always try and do in my own writing, kind of explaining, exposing and unpicking these often invisible networks of things that end up, having physical impacts, shaping cities like London. So the series, we're kicking off with housing. Next week we've got planning, looking at the future of the planning system, what's wrong with it, if it's a barrier to growth, or actually something that is relentlessly stripped of all resource and needs to be supported. The week after that, on the 2nd of February, we're having a debate on land, the kind of iniquities of the land market in London, how it can be reformed, how land can be opened up for kind of wider community-led development. Following week, on the 9th of February, we're having a debate on industry in the city, how it's being kind of relentlessly hounded out of London. Where are we going to manufacture things in the future? The 16th of February, week after that, is on public art and the role of artists in regeneration. Is art just a kind of bauble to decorate new development, or can artists somehow have a more meaningful role in regeneration in London? And last but not least, on the 23rd of February, we've got a session on landscape and the kind of current state of public realm in London, if gardening and greening is always a positive thing, or if maybe it's something where you should be looking behind the shrubbery to see what's going on behind the kind of greenwashing. So, tonight's topic, housing. We're going to try and not be too depressing, given that the current state of housing in London often makes you want to slit your wrists. I'm going to kick off with some of the worst bits to get it out of the way, a few slightly alarming statistics. Over the last decade, estate regeneration in London has seen a loss of over 8,000 council units. Even though those regeneration projects have claimed to double capacity, it's ended up in a net loss of over 8,000 socially rented homes. At the same time, homelessness has doubled, while the number of so-called affordable homes being built has fallen by a third. And as we all know, affordable housing is no longer really affordable to anyone. It means 80% of market rent, which means in Westminster, for example, to qualify for a 3-bedroom flat, you'd have to have an income of over £100,000. So not terribly affordable. The Evening Standard on Monday had a headline on the front page, "The death of the £300,000 home is in sight." And apparently a single person looking to buy a house in London now would have to wait 10.5 years to scrimp together a deposit. But it's not a crisis of housing, I would argue. It's a crisis of affordability and of access to housing, because there are over 57,000 homes in London lying empty as we speak, being sat on as investment units, people that actually have no need or desire to rent them out. So what are the problems? Part of it is the market is not delivering. We've left it to the market and they've failed, because the housing market, as we all know, doesn't behave like a normal market. It's not supply and demand. If there's a demand for more shoes, then we make more shoes. If there's a demand for more housing, we hold housing back to increase our profits and allow land values to spiral. At the same time, local authorities who have land are in an impossible position because they've had their housing grant slashed by over 60%. They're hindered by borrowing caps, and the good old Housing and Planning Act is going to force them to sell off their most valuable assets through the extension of right to buy. And there's a lack of space in London. Surely we've run out of space for more housing. That's not true either. The London Land Commission has shown there are 40,000 sites in London with a capacity to deliver a minimum of 130,000 homes. I'm sure the panel are going to disagree with a lot of this. I can hear murmuring already. So, perfect point to introduce our speakers. I've tried to bring together 5 of the kind of leading housing people working in London at the moment from very different perspectives. There are 5 people that are all deeply embedded in the production of how housing is made in London, but not all necessarily on the same page. So we've got from local councils that have set up their own kind of privately owned house building companies to try and solve this, the crisis, to developers building pocket-sized starter homes, another developer proposing the future of co-living micro-flats, and a community group building homes that will, in theory, remain permanently affordable. I'm going to introduce them one by one before they speak, but just briefly, we've got Barbara Brownlee coming up first, who's the Director of Housing and Regeneration at Westminster City Council. Following her will be Kareem Days of the Russ Community Land Trust in Lewisham. Amena Matin, who's the Head of Development of Brick by Brick, a private company which is the sole shareholder of which is Croydon Council. Following her, Reza Merchant, who's the founder of the Collective Co-Living Company. And finally, last but not least, Mark Vlessing, who's the founder and CEO of Pocket Living, which is producing affordable starter homes. So we're going to kick off with Barbara. Barbara spent over 25 years working in the housing sector in both public and private sectors. She's worked for various London boroughs, including Tower Hamlets and Thurrock in Essex, where she set up the borough's first council-owned housing company, Gloriana, to build affordable housing. I've been to see it, and it's definitely worthy of all the awards that it's been showered with. And in Westminster, she's facing one of the biggest challenges yet, given that the good old Guardian revealed last week that Westminster Council is currently shipping its social housing waiting list residents as far away as Coventry, given that they've run out of space in their borough. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Barbara for her 5-minute pitch, and be thinking of all the questions you want to ask, which we'll open up to the audience after the 5 presentations. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Ollie. Where to start? Do I do my presentation or do I talk about some of the things you said? Just one thing worth saying. Westminster has never and will never use 80% of market rent as an affordable rent. We realise that's ridiculous. We don't do it. We have 3 bands of affordable rent that are based on wage income, starting at £27,000 a year, and work on the premise that you should never spend more than 1/3 of your income on housing. So our affordable rent is not the same as the rest of London's, because clearly it wouldn't work. So I'll just correct that one, yeah? I'll let the rest go for a bit. Maybe it'll come out in the debate. Okay. This debate, 5 minutes, probably 4 left, was really set up as that we had an apocalyptic crisis going on in housing, yeah? We've used the words in the brief to the speakers, the system's straining, things are spiralling out of control, it's broken, people are being hounded out of London. Again, no one's going to Croydon. Okay, we can deal with that one later if anybody wants to ask me. But I want to think about the premise of that debate. I think that's really interesting because never before, and I have worked in housing for a long time, has there been so much said and written about housing as in the last year. And we have blamed varyingly, and you've run through them. We've blamed the planners. I've worked in boroughs where we had 700,000-800,000 planning permissions granted and nothing being built out. But we still blame the planners. We've blamed the scarcity of land. I agree, there isn't a scarcity of land. You could get on a train in the middle of London and within an hour you can be anywhere where you could build loads of housing. You can walk around London and find places to build housing. We've blamed the financial mechanisms. Ollie referred to the cap and lack of borrowing. Local authorities can prudentially borrow whatever they want, and whatever they can prove to their auditors is prudential to borrow to build housing. Right? There is not a shortage of cash to build housing either. And we've blamed a small number of powerful house builders. That's the supply and demand argument. They stop building and they stop selling when a price might fall. Okay, all of those things have been endlessly talked about for the last year, to the extent I don't believe there's a person in the room, if you're interested in housing, that you haven't heard those things. So I'm not going to go over them again. And I'm not going to try and sell Westminster. I'll answer questions about Westminster. I'm going to try and go through some facts about London. We sit here now in 2017 and there are 8.3 million people living in London. 150 years ago, there was 8.3 million people living in London. Right, now that's just a fact. So I want to look at what we've done to London, right, to change it so much that those people can no longer live reasonably in London. At that point, right, in the late 1890s, what we got was Victorian philanthropists coming along. We got them clearing slums. What we had at that point in London was the working poor crammed into rooms and people across the road living in huge houses in Belgravia and Mayfair. That suddenly, at a point in time in Victorian England, was perceived as wrong and unacceptable. Until that time, nobody had any problem with that at all, right? So we got people coming along, clearing that and building new homes for the working, deserving poor. They were better space standards. You might not think that now, but at the time they were. The first council housing that was built in 1909 in Finsbury Square actually took out more homes than it put back. Your example, right? That's what happens if you clear hovels and put back a reasonable 1-bed or 2-bed. Even though those flats look very small now. If you go in a Peabody estate, a William Sutton estate, a Samuel Lewis estate, they look teeny, they look dark. At the time, they were huge improvements. And they were seen as very high quality. At the same time as that, what was beginning to happen was transport, was really improving. And whilst we were housing happily the working classes in the centre of a city where there was industry, and there was manufacturing, and there was a river that was a working river, and there was still cigarette factories and match factories in Hackney, and that type of work for people, the middle classes were moving out. Because what was beginning to happen was we were beginning to develop the suburbs. Yes, so we had in the 1930s, Metroland. Metroland, the adverts were, get out of smelly, dirty London. It's bad for your health. If you've got any aspiration, if you want to look after your kids, if you want to move up in the world, move out. And we started building garden suburbs all around Ealing, Acton, at the ends of lines, at the end of tube lines. So we started thinking about space standards, and people started getting used to having family homes, the typical family homes that maybe a lot of people here grew up in. I don't know, that might be a huge presumption. But we had homes where grass was not at a huge premium, it was considered necessary, where dining rooms and kitchens and living rooms were considered necessary, on tube lines at half an hour out of central London.
I'll give you one.
Okay, we carried on, right, building new towns. So we had Stevenage and we had Hemel Hempstead, both wasted space. Look at them in the middle, huge lakes, huge amounts of grass. We now build absolutely in a different way. We have clever building in Croydon, right, where you can get, because of good use of space and good use of land, 165k, a decent one-bed flat. We have really clever space used in Streatham Hub, right? Good space standards, good use of energy, swimming pool, heating the flats above, absolutely works on the edge. 25 minutes from London, you can build beautiful flats on transport lines. My absolute supposition here is we do not have a crisis of housing. We have a belief that we are entitled to 3-bed houses with big gardens in the middle of an urban city, and you can't have them. You can have small flats. That's it.
Perfect. 6 minutes on the dot. That was wonderful, Barbara. Thank you. So, let's see if I can operate this. Yeah. Let me just make it full screen. So next up, I have with me here Kareem Days, who's the founding chair of the Rural Urban Synthesis Society in Lewisham, which I'm not going to try and explain because you're just about to. A musician by trade, but founded the Community Land Trust in 2009 in Lewisham. They're currently working to build 33 permanently affordable homes in Lewisham, building on the borough's pioneering legacy from the 1980s of Walter Siegel's self-build housing in Honor Oak, where Kareem himself grew up. So without further ado, over to Kareem.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm just going to come and really talk about our project and how we started, and then I guess in the questions we can talk about how that relates to the bigger picture. As Ollie just mentioned quickly, I grew up in South East London, in Lewisham is our local authorities, Honor Oak Park. The street I grew up in, everyone built their own house, and it was made from wood. I was in my mum's tummy when she built it with my dad. Just some pictures of them putting it up. So yeah, my mum and dad did that. They had 2 kids and had full-time work when they did this, and they built their own 3-bedroom house, and they've extended it over time. It's my dad. So I'm going through this because this was the inspiration behind setting up a new organisation to try and replicate that success. That's a picture of him on the roof. In 2008, I helped him renovate the house to make it kind of partly energy self-sufficient, put photovoltaics, ground source heat pump, re-insulated, triple glaze. And I guess the experience of working with him to renovate, upgrade, it kind of opened my mind to this idea of a house generating energy and sustainability. And there's some more shots, some of the houses. And I guess this was a real big inspiration because these houses were affordable. And as you can see, it's really, really high quality. I mean, Ollie's been to my house. I don't know if he wants to. They look and feel amazing, but they were really cheap to build at the time. So we decided, basically I got to the age where I had to move out. And so basically I lived a pretty sheltered childhood growing up on this great street in South London. And then only when I got into my late teens and I realized this is not normal. Like, most people don't have this and never had this opportunity. And if I want to be able to grow up, bring up my family, something like that, some of it's got to happen. So basically, we were inspired by that experience and then newer examples to basically set something up. We discovered Community Land Trust just from a bit of research. I lived in a housing co-op in New Cross Gate, so I knew about cooperatives. Somebody there told me about Community Land Trusts. And the thing about perpetuity is that the Walter Seagull homes, it was all funded by the council. They administered it, and then the people got a chance to get a mortgage at the end. And then everyone got a mortgage eventually. Some rented to begin with, then they got mortgaged. So they were all sold, and now they're all on the private housing market. So these homes were built for £30,000, and now they're going for £750,000, £800,000. So it's like, as an asset, it's being lost. It's now in the market. But it was public land to begin with. So the thing about community land trust is you retain ownership on some level in the land, retain an interest so that you can basically keep that asset on some level, varying degrees, in control of the community in terms of whoever buys into it has the local connection. It doesn't just become a free-for-all. So anyway, we set up, and we called the Rural Urban Synthesis Society because it's about sustainability, with this idea of making a London community sustainable, thinking about energy, food production. And we decided to start with housing, but a community land trust can be anything. A community land trust can be a school, it can be a shop, it can be a sports club. It's just about communal assets owned for the benefit of the community on a non-profit basis. So the whole board is volunteers, no one's paid. And the idea is that it's just about bringing maximum community benefit, and we have charitable status. So that's the model we're working on. And it's very similar to cooperative in that the members own the society, and they're accountable to the members. And anyone can join. You have to buy a £1 share. Everyone here could join if you want. You go to our website, you can become a member, and theoretically you're eligible to join the board and come to meetings and the rest of it. So anyway, how long have I got?
You've still got 2 minutes.
All right, cool. So we found the first site in Lewisham. So we basically, because of the history of Walter's Way, we decided it would make sense to start with Lewisham Council as a way of finding opportunities because they had that history. And then we got in touch with them and we kind of reminded them about that project. It was a long time ago, so the institutional memory wasn't necessarily there. And John Broom, who's an architect who worked with Walter Seagull on those schemes, on this picture you can see the bit of land which we basically, he gave us the tip-off because his mum lives, her garden backs onto it, and his family's lived there for about 100 years. His brother lives on the street. And he discovered that we set up on what we were trying to do, and he said, you should look at this site. And basically, it all started from there. We got in touch with the council and just said, look, self-build is amazing. We want to build affordable, sustainable homes for the benefit of the community. You own this site, work with us to do something. And just to cut a long story short, about 3 years of meeting, lobbying, campaigning, organising, doing workshops with local people, we built up enough support to really get the council to listen to us. And at the same time, we were doing kind of like pre-feasibility, showing that the numbers could work, how many homes can fit on it, and the rest of it. And then eventually the council decided to back the idea, but they had to do a competitive dialogue in order, because you can't, I try not to get into too much technicalities, but when you have a piece of public land, you can't just there has to be a process which is open and transparent. So we had to compete on this official Journal of the European Union competitive dialogue, and fortunately we got a grant from the GLA which helped fund our bid essentially for the site, which was successful. And that was last year, and we've basically since then we've been working with Archetype, the architects who were appointed to co-design a scheme for 33 units with local people, local residents. And the idea is, to be eligible to live here, you have to live or work in Lewisham for 2 of the last 5 years. We did a ballot to pick the residents. I'm just flicking through pictures of the site and the work we've done so far. We're getting ready to submit our planning application in late March, early April. And so 2012 was when we first identified the site. The competition we won that last year, and the rest of the time we've been essentially organising. So we've got over 600 members. Like I said, we're really inspired by self-build is a big element. So going to the housing crisis, the big picture, one of the interesting statistics is even if we wanted to build the houses we wanted to solve the crisis, as it were, we don't have the workforce to do it because you need X amount of workers on site building. So we think self-build is a really, really integral aspect in terms of giving people the opportunity to learn skills, develop skills on site. Like my mum and dad, my dad never built a house before, done anything. He learned electrics, plumbing, and since then he's gone on to use those skills in his career to doing that. We renovated the house ourselves, all the upgrades we did. So we're kind of arguing that self-build has the potential to empower local people to develop the skills they need to have thriving careers and lives in London. Because Lewisham, for example, has a big problem with young people not getting into higher education or skilled work. So we think we want to run apprenticeships and use it as an opportunity to build up the workforce capable of delivering the homes for the community that we need.
That's your 6 minutes gone.
Okay, and last bit, sorry, I want to get just more pictures. Yeah, so this is our website. Oh, no, it's gone to the end. Anyway, we can share some links after. But my point is, we're a community land trust, so it's open organisation. Anybody can join. We've got lots of student architects who've joined and got involved with the co-design, helping to run the project. It's just kind of, we want to open source it between now and our planning. So if you want to get involved, please visit the website. We're currently fundraising to help deliver this first scheme. So, and we're doing workshops on community housing, so we're sharing the 5 years of... Oh, I missed it again. We're sharing the 5 years of lessons we've learnt, which is really an ordeal for any group to do from scratch. We're trying to open source it, come along to a workshop and get involved. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Kareem's always far too modest when he presents this, because it's one of the most radical housing projects in London. I mean, the Community Land Trust as a model, I don't know. It literally, it takes this bit of land out of the market and links it to average income. You know, so it is going to be affordable forever in a way that housing that's still in the market won't be. You know, everything else will spiral out of control. And it's not a fringe movement. I mean, it's often dismissed, Community Land Trust, as a kind of hippie thing, you know, just a few people doing their straw bale, self-built houses. But there's now over 3,000 Community Land Trust homes in the pipeline, 225 groups across the country. It's like a growing resistance movement. So go to this website to find out more and read it in The Guardian as well. So next up, if I can find the presentation, we have Amena Matin, who is the head of development at Brick by Brick, which, as I said before, is a private company, the sole shareholder of which is the London Borough of Croydon. So it's not actually part of Croydon Council, but it's a kind of separate thing. Amena has worked at the Homes and Communities Agency, which is the national public body for funding affordable housing. She's worked for the Greater London Authority as a senior manager in the London Land Commission. And she joined Brick by Brick just under a year ago. And Brick by Brick itself is aiming to deliver over 1,000 high-quality new homes across the borough within 2 years' time. So quite a feat. Let me just make this full screen. So, Amena, over to you.
Thank you to Oliver and to Mel, and also to Barbara for promoting Croydon from Westminster. So thank you very much. So, is it down? Right. I thought I'd start with this slide, which is basically a plotted history of Croydon. I won't go into too much detail, but what we have here is through the 1960s and 1980s, there was a huge building programme to really meet the challenge of decentralisation that was happening in London at the time. And Croydon took a really bold decision at that time to build 49 new skyscrapers, which is really, really unusual now. And then over the last few years, it really declined in terms of having a destination and an identity. And what we've been doing over the last few years is really trying to build Croydon as a place again. And it's been really focused on technology and growth, and it's got its growth zone designation. But it hasn't really quite met its housing challenge yet. We have currently 4,000 units which have been consented in Croydon. If all of that came forward, this is what the skyline of Croydon would look like, which would be fantastic, but those schemes aren't coming forward. These are large schemes, normally, traditionally, speculative buyers who've got planning consent and haven't built them out. There are also developers who are working the borough, but equally, the value in Croydon just isn't there at the moment. So Croydon Council, about a year ago, decided that they would look at small sites because actually, in terms of delivering scale and to deliver the quantity that we need, they identified that this can only be delivered on land that the Croydon Council owns. But also, they needed a vehicle to be able to deliver that. So they established Brick by Brick, which is effectively a private company. So unlike other development companies which are wholly owned by the council, this works in a completely commercial way. But what we do is we borrow from the council, so development finance is all borrowed. We buy land from the council, so it's not at nil value. We do actually pay for it. Once we've built the homes out, the affordable units are actually purchased by the council. So again, they're creating new stock, we're creating jobs, and we're also putting investment back. What that enables is that the council can then reinvest that into council services, but also look at the landscape and the streetscape, and what else can they do with the money that they develop. But also there's a pipeline of development. So this creates a cycle of regeneration that's happening on council-owned land. We're currently bringing forward around 50 sites in the borough, which, as you can see, are plotted all around the borough. What this demonstrates is that actually we're not focused just on the high-value areas. We're actually looking at those sites where we can increase value through better design. At the moment, we've got about 50% of our programme in planning, which is around 500 units. So by just under a year, we've actually put together around 28 applications. I think that's great. I am slightly biased, obviously, but I think that goes to demonstrate that actually you can deliver housing on small sites if you've got the right vehicle. So why is Brick by Brick different? As I mentioned, we're a commercial company. We act completely in a commercial way, but by doing that, we can actually identify how we can improve and deliver more affordable housing. We're actually achieving 50% affordable housing across our portfolio of sites. It's about 19% in Croydon at the moment, so that's a huge increase. But we're also retaining an interest. We are keeping the shared ownership. That enables us to create an asset base, but also to deliver more revenue and generation in the borough. But also, importantly, we're focused on design. We've got 6 architectural practices that we're working with, and we've established our own in-house architectural practice. Because in order to change Croydon, we really need to think about the quality and high design. This is one of our schemes, currently in planning. It's currently a garage site. It's 7 shared ownership units. The average value in Croydon is around 350,000, so very affordable family housing. This is a 3-bedroom scheme. So if you're looking to buy, it's great for first-time buyers. Equally, this is New Addington, where we've struggled in terms of new build developments coming forward. So we're hoping with this scheme will actually be a catalyst for growth in the area. This is another scheme which is currently an infill site. And the architects have taken a really strong approach to design because, as you can see, it's very constrained in terms of the existing and adjacent properties. And so they've had to be quite innovative in terms of the massing and the design so that we actually don't have overlooking in the scheme. So it's a really, really tight site, and by cutting into it, they've actually been able to create a really good scheme. Again, shared ownership. This is a former garage site, and again, the architects have really thought about the place, and this is a really strong landscaping trim, really strong public realm that we're creating, which is, again, outside of the scheme, we're developing landscaping, public realm, streetscapes to complement the units that we're building. But we're also delivering larger schemes. Some of you may be familiar with the Cultural Quarter. So we are bringing forward Fairfield Halls. It's a huge regeneration project, and College Green, which is around 1,500 homes. So again, through our delivery vehicle, we're able to deliver not just small sites, but actually large sites, and deliver that at pace. It's currently in planning with a view to starting on the site this year and completion for phase 1 in 2020. I'm going to end with this slide. When I joined Croydon, and maybe I even thought Croydon was a certain place, for me, housing is more than unit numbers, it's more than targets, it's more than just large volume house builders, it's about perception. And what we're doing in Croydon, through Brick by Brick, is trying to change what the perception of Croydon is. There's lots happening. It is the fastest growing economy in terms of technology, but in terms of housing, we haven't quite hit our value yet. So through our schemes, we're delivering highly designed, quality, but affordable. The key to that, I think, actually would argue it's truly affordable because it is still a very low-value borough. And so actually, through what we're doing, we're hoping we'll change perception and that people think, isn't it effing amazing to come to Croydon, as Barbara said. Thank you.
I'm sure that's exactly what David Bowie is saying in wherever he is now. It's amazing in Croydon. I mean, a borough setting up its own, not only its own development company, but its own in-house architecture team is pretty groundbreaking these days. I mean, so many boroughs have given up on even trying to have any architects employed within the council. I might leave this on, given that Mark doesn't have any slides. This can be your backdrop. Next up, we've got Mark Vlessing, who's the co-founder and CEO of Pocket Living, which I think I'm right in saying is London's fastest growing housing company, according to The Economist. One of them, anyway. It's London's first private developer that focuses exclusively on delivering intermediate housing for people that they call city makers, which I'm sure we'll find out exactly what that means. Nurses, designers, teachers, engineers, and other middle-income Londoners essential to the city. They're compact flats, about 38 square meters, sold at around 20% discount to the usual market rate, and again, remain affordable in perpetuity through a very cunning mechanism, which I'm hoping Mark will be able to explain better than me. Currently, they have around 6,000 homes in the pipeline, I believe. So, over to Mark.
Great. Thank you very much.
You can either leave this on or get rid of it.
No, I'll keep David. That's fine. For those of you who haven't looked at our website, it's pocketliving.com. It's income-targeted housing. So the reason why it stays affordable is because you can only buy it if you live or work in the borough and you earn less than the Mayor of London's affordable housing income threshold, which has been set at the ludicrously high £90,000 because the Mayor very much hopes that one day somebody will come up with some family housing solutions. As you can imagine, if you take an average mortgage multiple of 4 to 4.5 times a household income, 90,000 times 4.5 might just get you a very small family home somewhere in London. Just to give you some stats, the average first-time buyer home in London today is £340,000. The mean income of your average Londoner is £33,000 a year. So it's palpably the case that the average Londoner cannot buy the average first-time buyer flat in London. Now, I'm going to pick up where Barbara left off and try and explain why we've got ourselves into this unholy mess. And I'd start by saying that countries get the housing they deserve culturally. If you're Dutch or German, you work from the principle that your Chancellor of the Exchequer is there to always make sure that inflation remains low, because you've got photos of great-grandfather with his wheelbarrow of useless Reichsmarks, because you know what superinflation looks like. And the deal is, even if it means that you have to bankrupt the Greeks, you keep inflation low for me. And if you have that deal with your Chancellor of the Exchequer, then you don't need to buy a home, because actually the value of that home is not going to go up too much. So you might as well rent it. Now, hands up, anybody in this country who believes that Chancellors of the Exchequers in the UK start from the principle that they have to keep inflation low. Clearly not the case. We don't want to join the euro because we want to be able to manipulate our money supply to suit our political ends, because we have this very autonomous, rather independent, inward-looking view of ourselves. Discuss. So, as a result, nobody in this room really believes that it's sensible to rent long-term, because your rapacious landlord may just increase that interest rate, rent on you as a result of inflation. So there are cultural reasons why we end up with the housing economies that we end up with. There's a cultural reason why we haven't thought about the housing in the middle, why we now have the squeeze middle, and that is because since the Attlee settlement of 1950, we've polarized the housing policy framework into the unbridled Victorian capitalism of people boring each other to tears over Sunday roast about their housing equity on the one hand, and on the other hand, the state-centric delivery of social housing for people in housing need. Now, if you do that long enough, and you expand your population, and London goes back from its low point in 1974 of 6.5 million people to 8.5 million people today, then clearly that squeeze middle eventually is going to will out. Because the old model was that Ollie would buy himself a broomstick cupboard in Kensal Rise, and he would then trade it for a one-bedroom flat in Shepherd's Bush, and he would then trade that for a two-bedroom home in Peckham Rise, and after 5 trades, at the age of 31, he'd have a partner and a dog, and they'd have a 2x2 somewhere in central London, or a partner and a baby, and that's how we all got on the housing ladder. Now, if you can't get your foot on the first rung of the housing ladder, you can't buy that broomstick cupboard, then you can't trade up. The average home in the UK trades once every 7 years. The average home in Germany trades once every 21 years. Back to the bored German, Housing is not sexy, it's not interesting. Maybe Berlin, a little. And that's only because all you Brits are coming to Berlin now and stoking up house prices. 3,000 young people are going to Berlin every year. London is now seeing for the first time young people leaving. There's a net migration of 20 to 30-year-olds of over 20,000. Only 12.5% of people between the age of 20 and 39 in London today can access home ownership without help from their parents and the government. So clearly, we have not thought about this middle market. And if we then project either unbridled Victorian capitalism onto them, they can't play. And if we project social housing on them, they're not eligible. Because actually, the average income of these people is somewhere around £33,000. They're not going to get to the top of any waiting list for that. So that's where Pocket started. How do we solve that problem? You have to make the home smaller. Now, this is not a disaster at all. Because actually, you guys have fewer CDs, fewer books, because you're digital. And actually, when you put your photos up on Facebook of the things that you care about, you don't put objects up there. You put up your experiences, your great holidays, the parties you went to, the music festivals you went to. You have a different lifestyle. The problem is that the planners out there, the people who run housing in London, are 20 years older than you on average. And they think that you have needs which you don't have. And if you had them, you wouldn't be able to afford them. So that's why what Reza is doing is smart. And that's why what I'm doing is smart. Look it up. I'm not going to bore you with how it works, but it's smart. And it all stems from a realization that we need diversity. There is no one-size-fits-all. Social housing, it's great. Civil society should ask its Labour leaders and its Conservative leaders, what is the minimum quantum of social housing that we should maintain at all costs for civil society at a discount to market of at least 50, 60% in a place like London. Not 20%, Barbara's right. Deeper than that. You ask any politician that question, you won't get an answer. I will finish on this note. 28% of the housing stock of London today is for social rent. I would argue that that is enough to meet the demands of civil society. The rest is all unbridled Victorian capitalism. Only 2% is intermediate. Everybody in this room needs intermediate housing. Let's start having that debate, and then we'll make some progress.
Wonderful. And all spoken in front of Mr. Bowie himself. I'm sorry, I got the order wrong. So now we have Reza. So let me just load this up. Screen mode. So Reza Merchant is the founder of The Collective, which describes itself as a co-living company. The Collective launched the world's largest co-living building in Old Oak in May last year, which is essentially a shared house that happens to have 550 bedrooms. So you're living with 549 other housemates with all manner of communal facilities and communal living spaces. They've got 2 new co-living towers currently under development in Canary Wharf and Stratford. And my favourite fact of the whole evening, British GQ last year listed The Collective in Old Oak as the second best thing in the world, just behind Drake. So over to you, Reza.
Good evening, everyone. Oliver, thank you very much for having me. So I'm going to start off just by setting the scene. So I think there are 2 sort of key factors, right? When I first started the business 6 years ago, I very quickly realized that there is a fundamental lack of supply of any remotely decent and affordable accommodation in London. The second issue is poor quality. Some of you may have seen this picture, which was on a documentary last year, but people are forced to live in absolute squalor. If you're earning sort of £20,000 to £50,000 a year, you're often forced to rent, illegally converted rooms in just terrible quality house shares. So those 2 factors really drove me to want to address this issue. That's a picture of the LSE library where I started the business with a £1,600 overdraft. And our sort of very first solution was what we called service living, where we sort of started to take on small rundown existing buildings and turn them into, well-designed and good quality sort of house shares and flat shares. Now, this proved successful, but what we sort of saw was that one thing was lacking, and that was community. At that scale, where we were sort of doing 10, 20 bedroom units, we weren't able to really build a community. And that was where sort of the idea of co-living came. Now, one of the other key drivers is the fact that our generation is very different to previous generations, right? As Mark was saying, we value experiences over material possessions. The way in which we consume is completely been transformed by technology, right? So if we want to book a taxi, we go on Uber and we order a taxi, right? If we want to book a holiday, we don't call a travel agent. We go online and within 5 clicks, right, we've got a holiday booked. We communicate via social media. And so all of these things we felt sort of, mean that there needs to be a type of housing that really responds to the way people actually want to live and responds to the way people actually consume. And that was really where co-living at Old Oak sort of stemmed from. Now, there are sort of 3 key pillars. I touched on community. So, the whole sort of experience at Old Oak is based around encouraging community and encouraging people to meet like-minded people, because we don't see ourselves as selling rooms. We see ourselves as selling access to potentially a life-changing experience where you have the possibility to meet your future husband, your future business partner, your future friends for life, and you can really have these shared experiences with people of shared interests. And so we have a range of shared spaces, everything from a library to a gym, a cinema room, a games room, a number of sort of shared communal dining rooms in addition to your kitchen facilities in your room, so that you can, have friends over and have meals with them. But by sharing, you get access to so much more, right? So you don't need your own dining room because you're not going to have a dinner party every night. By sharing, you really do get access to a lot more than you would otherwise. These are just some of the images. So we have on the top, you see the lobby. On the bottom, you see the library. And then the other picture is a picture of one of the shared dining rooms. The next sort of pillar is convenience. It's kind of linked to the way in which we're used to consuming. The current process for finding a flat or a house is the most inconvenient thing possible, right? You have to go through an agent. You then have to go through this long-winded process of referencing and signing a contract. And then once you get in, you then have to sort out all of your utility bills, your internet. We try and make the experience as convenient as possible. You pay one rent, and included in that is your rent for your living space, access to all of the communal spaces, all of your utility bills, so your gas, electricity, internet, water, council tax. You even get your sheets changed and your room cleaned. And there's an on-site team to make sure that maintenance problems are fixed as quickly as possible. And then the third is quality. So, we like to think that we provide a really sort of good quality of housing. And there's a real emphasis on design, right? So we've sort of built our own in-house design team, which is made up of interior designers and architects. And there's a real focus on creating a high-quality product. And all of these things combined, you know, in our opinion, we feel that, you know, we are sort of delivering a product that our generation actually wants to live in. Thank you.
Even within your 5 minutes. Brilliant. Can I just invite the panel to come and take a seat on our lovely sofas? Great. Well, where to begin, I suppose, given such an amazing range of projects, opinions, challenges, obstacles facing the future of housing in London. I hope you all have burning questions to grill our panel with, but I'm going to kick off with a few themes before opening up. We've got just over half an hour, so be thinking of what you want to challenge them on. I want to start with something quite specific, which I think is one of the biggest problems in UK housing, which is the size of our homes, given that our final two speakers between them were both proposing very compact solutions to housing in London. So Rez's bedrooms, I think, are about 10, 12 square metres. Pocket living homes are about 38 square metres, for which I think a new housing space standard had to be introduced to make it allowable. Croydon and Westminster, do you stick to London Housing Design Guide? So can we just talk about, I mean, famously the UK has, many reports say the smallest housing, rabbit hutch Britain in Europe. Do we think space standards are getting in the way? Like, if it was completely open to the market, would people actually want to live in even smaller properties? Do we need to enforce them more rigorously? What's your take on the size of homes?
Who are you asking?
Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
So, I think space standards are quite frankly outdated. At the end of the day, it's about functionality, right, and utility. And you can design compact spaces which have ample storage and ample space to live in, right? And you see it all the time, right? If you have sort of a 15 square meter studio versus a 30 square meter studio, people don't pay double the rent for the 30 square meter studio, right? And if space really was an issue and there was a linear relationship between space and value, then people would pay double. But the fact that people don't shows that utility and functionality is far more important than square meters.
Well, maybe useful, because we came to the completely opposite conclusion. So we're doing London Plan plus 10%.
Okay.
And that was from talking to our local people, and because the idea is that it's co-designed and collectively decisions and young families, and then people wanted bigger, lighter space because they're used to being in spaces which they feel are too small for them.
Yeah.
So I think what you two are doing sounds amazing. I'd happily have a smaller space, but that's the conclusion we came to. Yeah.
Was that mainly families though? Or?
It's mixed. It's a mixture. We've got everything. We've got one single units up to 4 bed, and there was just a feeling that, because I think the Walter Siegel thing is about flexibility as well at open, because we've got open plan downstairs. This idea of being able to reconfigure internal walls, and as say if your living situation changes, and being able to adapt the space. And because our inspiration was having the space to extend, and we don't have that, so it's like putting in more space over time as the community changes. There's a bit of flexibility for the buildings to adapt.
Barbara, what's Westminster's take on space standards?
Well, we stick, we don't budge. As I will know, we have a healthy debate. We don't have a collective in Westminster. So we stick with London house standards, space standards. I would say, to be realistic, this is the most unbalanced, fairly small country any of us could ever choose to live in. So everybody does want to seem, in the main, to live within a few square miles. Now, there's something realistic that we have to take on board about that. If we were evenly spread from Skye to London, everyone could have a bigger home. And we are absolutely not. And that is just a fact. So there is absolutely something about really, really, really good design and using every single inch of space you've got intelligently. And, you know, terrace houses don't use roofs and have really inefficient use of corridors. And there's lots of ways space standards have impeded us. And the garden cities I showed, they have masses of waste public space, which, you know, Croydon are now building on quite cleverly, and that public space costs money, and it has to have upkeep on it, so in some ways it's better to lose it. So whilst I think, if you lived in utopia, everybody would love a massive place to live. If you want to live in the southeast of England, you've got to get slightly realistic. Now, because we have that tension, we have space standards. We legislate.
Mark, could we get smaller? Are space standards too strict at the moment?
No, look, I'm wholly in favour of space standards. I think that the planning system is there to hold people accountable against standards which they need to live up to, and if they want to live below those standards, they need to come up with a justification why there should be an exemption from policy. By the way, I completely disagree with Patrick Schumacher at Zaha Hadid, who has this neocon view of how the free market could operate. It clearly is you know, it's not going to work. There's a reason why we ended up with the planning system. But you do need to be evidence-based. So New York is the interesting example. New York had Patrick's neocon unregulated market, and people were dying in their tenement blocks. The fire services couldn't get to them because nobody knew how many people there were living in these buildings. And so they imposed draconian space standards at the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, and they held on to them for dear life. And the net result of that is that today you have rent control in New York, which New York can't afford. The commuting times into New York are the longest commuting times for any working population in a world city because the flat standards are too large. And so if you set the bar at a level that is unrealistic, you do distort the market. You do have some pretty serious consequences from this stuff. So yes to standards. We're delighted that at 38 square meters for our compact one-bedroom homes, which are very well designed, we've got consent through in places like Westminster. But the truth of the matter is these rules are there for planners to hold you accountable and make sure that you do it well. And they are, of course, worried that people will do them badly.
But is it true that we're a generation of possessionless residents in London? Do a lot of your residents in either the collective or pocket living have to be renting big box storage elsewhere for their mountains of CDs, musical instruments, clothes, or do you provide enough storage?
Well, no, you've told me where you live, Ollie, and you live in a very lavish style, I have to say. You know, a large Victorian two-bedroom flat.
House in Hackney.
How many people can afford that? No, look, the truth is that, you know, they are making a choice. They could live in something larger in North Enfield or South Bromley, and they do not want to commute 1.5 hours each way every day. And I think that is a completely respectable choice. And by the way, I think it is a respectable choice for housing and planning directors to say, we're there in the city centres increasingly to try and help those single professionals and couples to render their services to the universities, to the academic institutions, to the private sector that we so desperately need. And yes, families probably ought to move with their children to the green spaces where there are schools, where family housing is going to be more affordable.
So only single people service people in those places? I don't understand that.
Well, 3/4 of London's housing is family housing. So there's a stat. It may not be occupied always by families, but it is actually built as family housing.
But I think we're running into a future problem if we just keep building smaller houses and we just have a product which is aimed at a certain demographic. We build to space standards because we're thinking about sustainable homes, and actually that the people who move in and buy our homes will actually want to think about staying there and creating families. And I think that's where space standards becomes a challenge about, are you thinking about a point in time or about building homes for the communities and generations coming in years and 20 years' time? And for that, in Croydon, that's particularly keen that we do that.
Yeah.
Can we talk a bit about access to land? I mentioned in my introduction that the London Land Commission has identified 40,000 sites across the capital with capacity for 130,000 homes. Why aren't we building those homes? What's the problem if the councils themselves own so much of this land? Okay. What's standing in your way?
Well, like Croydon, we are building on our own land. I mean, we're all councils in London, I think almost without exception, are building on their own land. and intensifying use on their own land. An enormous number of those sites are NHS sites. That's an extraordinarily complex relationship. That can take years to unpick to get a site built on. As we all know, because there's the jokes in the paper, some of those sites are 10 Downing Street, or Westminster, you know, there's a load of stuff. From my office, you can see the garden of Buckingham Palace. You could get a fair amount in there. You know, there's an awful lot of stuff in that survey, yeah? But councils are building on their own land, definitely. It's the easiest thing for us to do. We're allowed to borrow to do it. You know,
what are the main obstacles, you know, from the two local authorities, or semi-local authority we've got representing, what are standing in other boroughs' ways from doing that, from setting up these companies and building more council housing again?
I mean, from our perspective, I think Croydon took quite a risk. It's a very risky model, what they're doing with brick by brick. There are lots of other boroughs who probably go down the JV model, joint venture model, and enter into relationships with developers. And developing estates and estate renewal, that's not the model that Croydon has taken. They've looked at small infill sites and suburban intensification, and that's the way they've been able to deliver scale and pace. And it is about choices. And I absolutely agree with Barbara that actually the London Land Commission, which I worked on, as Mark knows, it was my little baby, most of that is actually Network Rail NHS land. So are boroughs meeting their housing challenge by delivering on their land? I would say yes. Are they making the right choices? I think there's probably more informed choices they can make in terms of the delivery vehicles that they use to bring those houses forward.
But there is an inherent problem in public life when it comes to releasing public land for any particular purpose, which is, you know, the enemy in the room is the borough solicitor. You know, these people do not join the legal departments of councils because they want to have hot, thriving commercial careers. And they worry hugely about probity and due process. And, you know, they put you through ticking boxes, and then once you've ticked all their boxes, they invent boxes that you never knew existed before. So that's one problem, which is why public land is released so slowly. And it is a scandal at how slowly it is released. The second problem we've got is that, you know, most local authorities are not hugely joined up between the housing departments, the property services department, the planning department. So the housing department wants to have affordable housing on there. The property services department wants to sell it to Candy and Candy to raise as much money in order to balance the budget. And the planning department wants to put a bungalow on it because really it doesn't want to bother itself with a high-rise. So, you know, and unless you've got a leader and a chief executive and some very powerful directors like Barbara who have a corporate view, and Amina, who can bring these parties together, you get this highly fragmented, very dysfunctional approach towards public land. So we don't use public land strategically well enough.
To build on Mark's point, I also think that the culture in local authorities is not particularly entrepreneurial. You know, there are a few councils like Croydon who are, but on the whole, like, they're not sort of particularly forward-thinking and entrepreneurial. And if you want to build housing and develop, like, it's, you know, it's risky and you have to have an entrepreneurial approach.
Can we talk a bit about the Lewisham example? I think it's fascinating, you know, how a community group could actually, you know, convince a council to essentially gift, or maybe not quite gift, but allocate this piece of land for a community-led development. How did that work?
Well, our angle has always been that public land is worth more if you work with communities to develop it for community benefit. And I think the New Economic Foundation have done a study and some report that show that, you know, a lot of councils, because of austerity, because of the cuts, are kind of forced to look at what they've got. And, you know, we talk about the legal department, like they're kind of forced to kind of sell to the highest bidder often. And we've always argued that actually by working with a group of us, you might get less money up front, but over time, by housing local people, working with local people, those benefits outweigh that nominal money you get up front for selling it to the highest bidder. So just bringing the conversation to a bigger picture, I think there needs to be a big movement in the civil society to really pressure councils, hold them to account not to sell off public land. I think we're kind of sleepwalking into disaster in that it's all going to be sold off to the highest bidder. They'll cover the gap for a couple of years and then they'll be in the same problem. And what gets developed on public land, I don't know. Living in Lewisham and looking around London, as someone who's born and bred in London, when I look around and see what's being built on public land, it ain't for no one who's in London now. All who's born here, it's for people, it's for Hong Kong. They market this stuff in Hong Kong. They don't even market to us. The advert's in Hong Kong. It's like this. And someone mentioned about the empty homes earlier. They're not even trying to cater to anyone here. They just want to make a quick buck. And I think one thing I would urge everybody here is to get active, like hold people to account. I posted a couple of links on your Twitter. There's now the self-build register. Surprisingly, it was backed by like a cross-party that the local authorities have to keep a register of people locally who want to build, and they have to include that in part of their planning policy. I would encourage everyone to sign that and really be involved with your local civil society to hold your council to account when public land is up for sale.
And councils are legally obliged to take what's called best consideration when disposing of public land, and they can argue that long-term community benefit it has a greater long-term value than flogging it to Berkeley Homes. It's eminently possible. Just while we're on land, can I ask Croydon, or brick by brick, this is public land that's ultimately being sold off, or are these houses for rent?
So we are doing a mixture of tenures. So there'll be affordable rented units, which actually aren't at the 80% of market rent. They'll be bought by the council with delivering shared ownership units as well, which we'll retain.
I can see lots of hands. I think I should probably start opening it up. Is there a roving microphone somewhere? Yes, coming from the back. I should stand up so I can see it. Yeah, we'll begin with that one there.
Hello. My question involves the community land trust model and wanting to know why Russ made the decision to sort of do it alone and maybe not incorporate some of the more competitive models that the two other speakers have discussed, or more specifically not involved a private developer in their project. And for it to be truly scalable, do you believe that would have to happen? And to pick up on Oliver's point that he said, it's fascinating that the council should give you this. Why is it fascinating? Why are Russ being put through competitive tenures that cost £80,000, which they cannot afford, in my opinion, or any charity-based organisation, when it should be a far more symbiotic relationship between the council and such amazing schemes as Russ?
I think that's a really good question. Yeah. I mean, I can see there's someone in the back who might be able to tell us more. But it's a tricky one. I mean, we got into that. I'm not a developer. I'm not an expert. I've had to learn as I go along. You know, I'm not trying to come like we've got all the answers. It's not by any means perfect. But I think it's this idea coming from the self-build idea that we can do it. We have the skills we can develop within our community to do these kinds of things. And I think you're right. As a civil sector society, if we're going to kind of fill this gap and develop, we do need to kind of upskill and share the lessons we learn as we go. But I don't know, man. When I look at what's happening, I think people have said we're part of a housing association and we've looked into that. But in terms of retaining autonomy and control and the principles of what you're about and trying to deliver, we just kind of we went alone. We felt like we had the ability to do it, and we've got this far now. And we were lucky to have a really skillful team of people who had a lot of input. We got grant money from the GLA, which is able for us to kind of put some real detail into our plans. We weren't going to them with just, any old sketch, and we'd properly done proper feasibility and we've got, really good people involved. But the question of scale is a good one. I would argue that, I think you made a good point about culture in the UK. The culture, for example, I know in places like Holland and Germany, the culture of self-initiated housing, if you want to broaden the term, like communities organising themselves to build, it's much bigger. Like globally, self-build is like 70%. It's more normal to be involved in designing and the construction of your own home. It's because that's, and actually affects quality.
But to play devil's advocate for a minute, doesn't it also represent a kind of shirking, councils shirking their responsibilities to provide housing? Isn't community-led housing can also be seen as the big society in action and a kind of symptom of the fact that the state isn't playing its role?
Come on, let's be serious about it. Camden and Westminster are the most judicially reviewed councils in the United Kingdom. They spend absolute fortunes justifying every single decision that gets JR'd by people like you and me who've got, educations and are, they've got a fax machine. The absolute kiss of death, NIMBYs with fax machines, and they will put you in knots. And we don't like development in this country. And so the reason why they have to go through these procurement hells is because they really do need to justify to their politicians that they've done it properly, because otherwise they're going to have a judicial review.
How would you choose this group? We sat there and heard your story, and it's amazing. And I think Mark and I both rolled our eyes at your bit of procurement and thought, oh my God, Why do we have to put you through that? It's clearly ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well,
You've
it's
got a
the legal
public money
department.
grant to make a tender for a piece of public land. On the other hand, right, if Lewisham had given you that, 10,000 people could have immediately taken Lewisham to court and said, why that group? Right? You cannot give away public land. It is, you can simplify the system, right? Potentially you can simplify procurement, and you can support community and charities to do it, which is what, what happened, wasn't it? The GLA supported you and paid to help you bid, which kind of feels a bit like you're whirling public money round and round in horrible circles. But it's the only way, as Mark says, we get judicially reviewed by the day on every housing decision we make. If we're going to be under that level of spotlight, we have to absolutely have rule books, horrible rule books of how we do it. I want to slightly back to your question where you said, why don't more councils do more in London? If you look at the councils, I think there's something about resources and history and trust. And if you look at some of the London boroughs where they've got stable politics and a chief and a director of regen or development, and you can see them in West London. I would name Ealing as one of the best. You can see Croydon. They are absolutely developing. They are developing fast, they are developing well, and they're using all their land.
And is it the borrowing cap that's getting in the way most? Like
No.
doing more?
They're developing on prudential borrowing.
But actually, one of the things that
Borrowing
gets in
cap.
the way...
Can I just quickly
Sorry, can I
just come back
answer
on
that
that, just
point?
because I've
It's
still
an
got the mic
important
before I hand
point.
it
If I may
over.
just answer that point.
Oh, he's still going. The thing was, I was
reason-
Just one
hoping...
second.
No, I just want to answer that point because it really is important. The reason why it's so difficult for the councils... The reason why it's so difficult for the councils is because it is incredibly difficult to recruit good, talented people in development and management at the kind of pay scales that they can afford to pay. We are bereft of enough professionals in
Can I
London.
just do a
in
quick
development.
survey of students in the audience, if anyone is thinking of going into the public sector in terms of being an architect for a local authority, working for a council-owned housing development company, getting involved in the planning system?
There you go.
Can I just
Here's
ask
your
the panel-
talent
That's
pool.
not a lot of hands.
Not many.
Oh, that's a good
just
number.
So they're having to recruit from
Not
the
enough.
private sector.
Not enough.
It's hard.
Not enough. We need more.
Was there another?
Yeah, can I just quickly ask how the rest of the panel can make Ross more competitive? Because none of you really sort of said how you could bring your knowledge into supercharging the community land trust model, because you've all got loads of knowledge on that, so why not
How
help?
to make them more commercially competitive? Or?
Well, if they were more commercially competitive, they wouldn't have had to got the loan from the GVLA to afford the tenure, but I mean just if they did have an extra bit of money or whatever in order to be able to cover their costs, they would be scalable.
Can I just say, in terms of Croydon Council, brick by brick, we are actually working with the Croydon CLT, and actually we've identified or trying to identify routes as to how we can bring forward land with CLTs, and not necessarily overcoming some of those challenges around judicial review and procurement, but actually trying to close off some of that risk so that we can work with CLTs. And equally, in terms of your gentleman's particular point there, we're using the expertise through Brick by Brick to also bring that development management to support the CLT. So actually, I think there is a way you can do that, but you have to be aware that those risks exist and be very open and authentic about how you work with other providers. But I think there is clearly a challenge that large-scale house builders may not necessarily be the answer, and you have to start looking at different ways of delivering housing. And actually, the more you can bring the community along with you in that process, the better for delivering more housing. So actually in Croydon, I would say, and it comes back to having a strong leadership and a strong direction, our leader has gone on record and fairly committed to delivering more housing and working with CLTs. So you can, and we are trying to find avenues to do this, and I would say actually it's about squaring the risk first, but not using that as a barrier to working with CLTs.
Move on to the next question, if that's okay.
Is there another one? Yeah.
Yeah. Question to Reza, right? And Mark, which I thought it was really interesting, the fact that considering our generation and where we are right now and what we're doing, but like my main concern is like how come we're still like designing such static designs of housing when everything is becoming more and more and more moving faster and faster? Like how come we're not heading towards something that's a bit more like the Ross Community Land was way more flexible? Like I thought the collective projects is really interesting to respond like on short-term like issues that we have, but like long term, like something that's really dynamic, such as housing, like how come it's not a bit more flexible, not a bit more like
Flexible in
seagull?
what sense?
In the fact that we grow up, we have kids, and afterwards you grow old, and nobody like can live forever in a 5 meter square flat. Like, and how come the design of our generation, such in the collective's design, is not like more flexible, more adaptable to growing up?
So I think, you know, you can't be all things to all people. And design, you know, someone single who's aged between 21 and 35 has very different needs from their housing compared to a young family, right? So from a design perspective, it's like we chose to be very specific about targeting a particular niche and creating a product that perfectly sort of caters to their needs, right? And so
I understand this, and I that's why I love your project. Respond very much to our generation. But I'm more talking bigger picture of housing. Like, how come we're really like responding to like really issues like punctual and not like addressing the sorts of larger.
Okay,
But
that
then
is
what-
planning.
But the
That is
councils,
plan-
yeah,
Can I
you
just
guys
say-
look at different typologies and
that is-
flexible.
Well, I mean, in that specific instance, that's because that housing wouldn't get a planning consent for housing. It wouldn't get a housing consent. It isn't seen legally as housing. So what you're not allowed to do if you've got, because it's too small, right? Because it doesn't meet a single space standard in this country. So it gets a planning permission that doesn't allow you to knock walls down, put units together, and make it grow into something bigger. In that instant, that's very specific. I think you're right. I think you've got a good point. Councils kind of play around with lifetime homes, and they build stuff with 1.5 bedrooms, you know, where you can have a guest or an office or a bigger living room and walls move. And we have stuff that you can get older in, much, you know, that you can adapt for disability and aging. We don't, I think, anyway, have the level of flexibility you're mentioning. I think we do bits of it.
Bit of both of those points. We are, with our architects, and we're an unusual company in that we have 10% of our workforce is in design and thinks about architecture. We have a director of architecture. We are thinking about how we can make our buildings more adaptable, like the old Victorian model, where you just knock through walls and you can turn these compact one-bedroom homes eventually into three-bedroom homes. We're also starting to build compact two-bedroom and three-bedroom homes to follow people through. But when we have to follow them through from having been able to get them into Camden in their compact one-bedroom home, once they've got children, we follow them through into their 2 or 3 bedroom home. We're following them into Ealing, and we're following them into Croydon. So they are having to move from zones 1.5, 2.5 into zones 4, 4.5. So we are trying to be flexible about it. But I think Reza is right. I think you have to be clear about what your niche is. One of the problems that we've got in the UK, and it's worth actually stating this, is that our volume house builders are larger than anything else in continental Europe, and our small builders are much, much smaller. And the volume house builders have this one-size-fits-all approach to development, where they are meant to be everything. They do 1 beds, 2 beds, 3 beds, family housing, penthouse suites, social housing, and you can't be good at doing all of these things. And on the whole, they're not.
I would say, if anybody really wanted to challenge local authorities, rather than actually make, I think, you know, that wonderful housing model massively scalable, because I think that is very difficult. I think it will always stay small. The real challenge, I think, for local authorities is to use their power to challenge exactly what Mark's just said, which is the very tiny number of house builders who produce off the peg buildings at the rate they want to produce them. Now, if you're going to use local authorities for something clever, right, what we should be doing is absolutely supporting and developing a huge varied market of different and smaller builders. And that is a really good role a local authority could play in this country.
And is it doing that? Is that what something
I
like
think
Brick
lots of
stimulating?
local authorities are doing it. I think Essex, if you go out to Essex at the minute, Essex County Council has a whole unit absolutely focused on doing that. Breaking down the fact that every single housing procurement is won by one of 5 people and trying to get it more varied, smaller, and room.
If it's being led in-house, do you have the power to do that?
Sorry, in terms of delivering...
Yeah, in terms of delivering kind of alternative typologies rather than the identikit volume house builder stuff.
Absolutely. We don't take a cookie-cutter approach to our typologies. You will have seen from the schemes that I showed you that we look at the sites and look at what the site can accommodate in terms of design and massing and height, etc. And actually, just in terms of the gentleman's question there, we do deliver family housing, and we are looking at family housing in areas that probably they don't have family housing at the moment, so that we do create a different type of offer in those areas. And I think actually we're probably not being particularly honest as well, because I would say, I'm sure the developers will admit, that actually it costs more money to build family housing, and therefore you have to do that in the right areas. The cost of build has to be equivalent to the cost and the value of what you will get for that unit. So actually, we've taken a very entrepreneurial approach in terms of where we deliver family housing. It has to work from a value perspective as well. It's affordable for you to buy, it's not necessarily affordable for us to build. So therefore, some of the areas that you're building in, high value areas, you probably wouldn't deliver family housing. That's not your product.
Just picking up on the SME point, because it's such an important point that Barbara made. In 1939, 70% of housing in this country was built by regional and small developers. Today, 60% of all housing in the UK is built by the top 5 companies. We've comprehensively lost all those SMEs. You know, there is not a politician left, thank God now, who believes that from the volume house builder and the housing association movement, you will get the volume increases in supply required to even get close to an equilibrium between demand and supply in this country. Because it stands to reason. If they had been capable of doing so, why didn't they do so in the last 20 years? This housing crisis didn't just appear out of nowhere, but they can't do it. They can't do it because the volume house builder has no commercial interest in doing it for the reasons that were explained earlier. And the housing associations have a very troubled and difficult relationship with successive governments. Sometimes they have an embarrassment of riches when there's a Labour government, and then the whole thing gets switched off. Well, you know what? We may have 4 to 5 year political cycles, but running housing associations is a 12 to 15 year cycle business. And if you're subjected to endless political interference about what you can do one day and not the next, it becomes very, very difficult to become a consistent supplier. So you need the SMEs to become the buffer, the new force, because otherwise none of this will be sorted.
We'll move on to the next question that was in.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
My question was, I mean, we've talked about sort of niche private sector and a lot about public sector supply of land, but is that not sort of tinkering around the edges, and is not the fundamental problem that we see housing as an investment and a source of wealth rather than a social need or like a human right? And what do we need to change? What can we do in our culture or our politics to disincentivize that behavior and to change behavior on like a national level?
Make housing boring.
Make housing boring. Do you know? Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people agree. I think it's not a local authority issue, it's macroeconomics you're talking about. This country's wealth is inherently held in its housing. The middle classes depend on their housing going up every year. It's what pays for their kids' schooling, their kids' university. It's what is their pension nowadays. It pays for a lot of people's private health care. You know, that is a fact. That's how we run it economically in this country. If you want to change that, get elected.
But there's a report saying, I think by 2020, 60% of Londoners will be in the private rented sector.
Yeah.
And it's a question, that seems like, oh, doom and gloom, we're all going to be renting. Why not? Why not? Why shouldn't we be celebrating renting? Why, for example, is Pocket Living selling its houses and not renting?
Oh, I'd love to rent it out, but I haven't got a balance sheet to carry it on. Eventually we'll be big enough, we'll be able to keep our housing because, you know, you'd actually get a better return over time. But this cultural point about great-grandfather in Germany pushing his wheelbarrow around the place and expectations of inflation, that this takes a long, long, long time to change. You'd have to have 50, 60 years of really stable inflation, low house price growth. You believe that?
Yeah.
Low house price growth. To change the cultural attitudes that people have towards home ownership. It's just not going to happen very quickly.
Could the collective make it happen?
Well, so look, I think that there has already started to sort of be a shift in what people prioritize, right? So 10, 20 years ago, people sort of would aspire to, you know, come out of university, get a job, and save for their deposit. Whereas now what we see is that people are less concerned about saving because they want to go and they want to experience life, right? They want to go to music festivals and, you know, actually spend money on experiences rather than, you know, continue to save for.
The rest, they've given up hope. They don't believe that they will ever save enough to get to that bloody deposit. The reason why you've got so many people between the age of 27 and 30 in your homes is because they've given up.
Well,
But if
I
you
think
ask
that's
them what
quite
they
a
would want...
pessimistic way of looking
Well,
at
but
it.
it's
right?
true.
We could do a quick
Yeah,
straw
that
poll.
might-
Who in the room is kind of happy and positive about renting in London? And okay, no one.
Can I just, there's a lot of real research that shows people with capital assets generally do better in life. You know, the last time we had a Labour government, what they did was they spent a lot of time transferring capital assets down the chain. They didn't do that for no reason, right? People are not happy renting. The basis of success in this country that we live in is around home ownership. Financial success, that's all.
But does that equate to happiness?
Well, different question, no idea.
How is the CLT model? Are you renting, owning? How does that work?
I went to a talk that Lewisham organised about the private rented sector. And if I knew I was paying my rent to a local organisation which was set up specifically to provide housing for local people, I'd be happy to pay rent as long as I had to pay rent. Like, I think it's the context you're working within.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's fair.
I don't know, like this idea of home ownership, I think the statistic is any land or house transaction, most people who buy houses or land come from families that already own housing land. And it's the same, it's the big picture stuff, it's the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And it's within land and housing, it's plain to see. That's why I think, you know, as a civil society, we need to kind of get, the anger's there, but that anger needs now to be organised into like some real positive. And you said someone's got to stand, but I feel like Sadiq Khan and GLA now is an opportunity there. Before he got elected, he stood in front of a room of 6,000 people and promised to deliver 1,000 community land trust homes within his term. I think we need to hold him to account to those kinds of promises and organise ourselves enough so that we're able to do something. Like you started your thing with an overdraft. We started our thing with my student loan to pay the money to set up, like get together, form a co-op, these mutual home ownership. It's not just CLT. CLT is one thing within the community sector. And I think the mutual home ownership model, I think is something we're going to see grow in terms of people coming together to buy equity together in groups, maybe not the traditional family unit, but like, for example, in our scheme, when we did the ballot, people got together to bid for the houses as a co-op within the CLT. And I think that level of organisation, if all of you got together with 20 of your mates and you put 1% of your annual income into this account and kept doing those kinds of things, like, I think there are ways that we could...
That's happening in Berlin, and it's very successful. And by the way, I think you're so right that you guys do need to get political about housing.
It's happening in Leeds as well. The UK's first mutual home ownership trust is called Lilac, if anyone wants to look it up.
You know,
And
where are
that's
your
the model
placards?
that
Where are your
fingers
barricades?
crossed will spread.
You need to start making your voices heard on this.
And if you do look at mainland Europe, most people do expect that they will start putting into their local co-op. You know, the day that somebody has a child, that's when you start doing it. Because that is how housing is financed and built and rented in Europe. Yeah. So there is a complete long-term, a really different model to the model we have here. And, you know, that's a marvellous example of it.
We've got time for a couple more. There's one already there. Who wants to have the last question? Yeah, back there. So we'll start with the one.
This was in response to what Mark was saying about housing associations, like, coming over more troubles, and from what I understand, a lot less funding. And it seems that they're, in essence, acting like developers. So I wondered what people's opinions were on the role of the housing association now, as in who they are really providing for, and what's really the difference between their role and responsibility compared to a traditional commercial developer.
Who wants to go first with that?
So seeing how I proposed the question,
housing associations and everyone's sighing.
It takes 12 to 15. It takes 10 to 20 years, in my experience, to build the kind of muscle that you need as a corporation, whether you're public or private sector, to become effective at delivering homes. And one of the reasons why it's going to be so difficult for the local authorities to do this is the last time they did it was in the 50s and the 60s, and it took them 15 years. And they got really good at it in places like Camden, but then it all disappeared under Thatcher. So when you've got muscle in the housing association movement, it's kind of quite mad for a government to try and switch that off. It was mad of Osborne to have come up with a negative rent deal with the housing association world at the very point at which we definitely needed more supply. So I think my answer to you is that we've put them in a very difficult position, because the best of them that have got form are increasingly going to have to think of themselves as private sector corporations in order to build more and more private housing in order to cross-subsidize the social housing that they still, in their brief, in their ethos, would like to do, but there isn't the grant to do it. So, unless you get a government that's going to pump a lot more money into them, I think that the small ones will become less and less efficient. I think there are going to be more and more mergers, which is what we've seen in the last couple of years. There will be more mergers. And I think if we're not careful, there will be a disappearance of the housing association, social housing ethos within that movement. And I think that will be a disaster for the country.
Yeah. I think there's such a range, it's incredible.
Yeah.
I think there are some that still hold very tightly to their aims and objectives and their charitable status, and they serve a very local area or a particular population. I believe, exactly as Mark said, they will begin to disappear, but I think now they are really good organisations to have in a landscape of housing providers. I think there's a fact, if you want sub-market housing, you have to put a subsidy into it, right? So if you want housing associations to be able to build at sub-market rent in any way, either to sell at sub-market rates or to rent at sub-market rates, as a country, we have to agree to put subsidy in. And that subsidy's gone, so they are replacing it with sale proceeds from, a different part of the organisation. And to be fair to them, there's very little else they can do if there's no subsidy. So what they're doing is they're saying, okay, well, we'll still rent a bit at sub-market rates, but now we need to find our own subsidy. So we'll find that by building and selling over here. And while there's no public subsidy, they either stop growing entirely or they find a way of making money themselves, because you can't build sub-market rent without subsidy. So I don't think they're good, but I think it's true.
Is this the model essentially behind brick by brick, how it can operate?
Yeah, well, I would say Watson Housing Association's USP now, if you've got local authorities that are delivering and can be registered providers, and you've got development companies who can own and manage, albeit perhaps not the affordable housing, but since we're selling the units back to the council can then own and manage in a different way. I would say, yes, they're good at managing their stock now, but actually, aren't they just losing that USP? And why, therefore, are we promoting them as still the only method? They're not anymore.
I don't think anyone is saying that.
And so I think, actually, what's their role now? I think, actually, we do need to start breaking that up, because I think, in the same way we look at volume house builders perhaps are, taking more, a little bit conglomerate, I would say RPs are also in that category. And therefore, we have to start thinking about not looking at existing providers and existing stock, but actually the type of models that we're talking about here to do more.
Do you want to comment on housing associations?
Well, I think it's interesting because I know there was one near us in Isham Hyde. They started out as a bunch of squatters. You managed to get some housing somehow, and then they just built it up until they had thousands of homes and turning over multi-million.
Huge one in Westminster.
Yeah, and I think is it
many started from good roots.
It's an interesting example for people kind of working outside the system and challenging the way things are and how start working within all that. And I think it's interesting for community land trust now is that it's a good time for those models and cooperatives to come through and fill a gap maybe the housing associations are not filling anymore. And one crucial bit that's helped that is CLTs are exempt from the right to buy as things stand. That's a massive thing. You mentioned it briefly, the whole right to buy issue. Like, we're building all this sub-market subsidised stock and it just gets sold off faster than you can build it. But the CLT model is that if we have rent, we've got social rental units and affordable rents, they'll never be sold. They will remain rented forever.
Is it the only form of affordable housing now that's immune from right to buy?
I don't know.
No. Yeah, no. I was going to say, any wholly owned company of any council, assured short-term tenancy is immune from right to buy.
Yeah, and so we are looking at models of Croydon Council where they will buy the units back, but they wouldn't be never subject to right to buy. Yeah.
That's a choice, isn't it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Final question from the gentleman back there.
Hello. So a lot of the speakers today seem to be reacting to the current problems. I think the reason Kareem speaks to a lot of people out here because he's saying we can work outside the current system. Majority of the speakers seem to be working inside the current system of we have to do this, proposing that we have to live smaller and smaller, or that we can live in these kind of hotel-esque things where someone comes and changes your sheets, and it's like extended student living. But to what extent do we have to change the actual system completely, like the question was saying before, and introduce rent caps and clamp down on second homes, and say things like foreign developers can't actually come in and hold houses? I think that's the real problem here. We need to go to the core and say the system itself is broken. We should stop reacting to it, and actually fix the system.
Yeah, we're just proposing little sticking plasters for what's ultimately a totally rotten system. Start a revolution
Can I
in
just say,
Croydon.
in terms of foreign investors, and again, Croydon Council have very strong leadership in that respect, we're introducing a local sales policy, and that's going to be localised to the extent where if we're building on infill sites within estates, it's that estate, that ward, which will have first dibs over those properties coming forward, and therefore it's also affordable in terms of median incomes for that ward. So I think that's the way you overcome that challenge of having these empty properties perhaps being sold off and then used for rent, buy-to-rent, etc. That's the way you do it. You have to introduce policies at local level, because actually the housing agenda isn't a programme, it's not about a government initiative, it starts locally. And for us, that's what we're doing,
So
introducing
boroughs
policies.
just need to be braver, no, and take lessons from...
I definitely think Croydon's kind of thought about all parts of the development cycle, from the start of finding land to completing a unit, who's going to live in it, and how do we accommodate that to make sure that it's local people that can stay, or people want to come and buy in the borough and therefore stay.
When it comes to sort of changing the system, I agree that our system is broken and there need to be significant changes, but it takes time, right? I mean, we started speaking to the GLA in 2013 about our housing product, and it took 2 to 3 years to make any sort of material sort of progress, right? And so, if you want to deliver something and you want to get on with it, unfortunately you're forced to sort of work with the current system and just make it work, right? Otherwise you're going to be sitting twiddling your thumbs for 2 to 3 years.
Can I just counter a little bit? I think we should be a bit careful about the very fashionable government-sponsored xenophobia when it comes to foreigners. The truth of the matter is that the foreigners who are buying in London are mainly buying in Zone 1. Well, anybody who's read their Dickens will know that's been going on for a long time. The Russians and the French have owned Mayfair for a long time. They are providing capital to the housing market. They are getting stuff built. I think there should be sales policies. I think there should be a clearer attitude between planners and developers as to how we try and prioritise people who are local on particular incomes, which is what Pocket does. But I think we should just be a little bit careful about going much further than that, because before you know it, you're going to be saying that anybody who hasn't got a UK passport is not allowed to buy in London. That would be a disaster. It would be a disaster for London as a world city. It would be a disaster for housing in London. And it would be a disaster for all of you. I suspect many of you hold a foreign passport.
But I don't know anyone suggesting that. It's the thing when they do it and they're empty. They build these things and they stay empty. It's like there should be at least a rule to say they need to be occupied as a minimum.
The GLA has done a lot of research on that, and
They can't find these
it's
houses.
just not. It's not true. It's just not true.
No,
They are renting them out. They are renting them out. It's a bit of a fallacy. This.
I suppose there's one very urgent-looking question at the back, so that will actually be the final one, and then we can all go to the bar.
Oh yes.
Hi. Question for Reza. I understand how the collective is a product for young people who have to or want to rent before they can buy. Presumably, with the extra services, though, it costs more than renting an average room. I'm just wondering how the model contributes to the long-term economic security of those people, and would they have been better off if they'd just gone through a private landlord and have more money for a deposit?
So actually, if you look at what we charge, and if you sort of look at the services that are included, like the gym, all of the utility bills, it's actually very comparable to what you would pay for a room. But what you can't compare is the quality of the living experience and the product, right?
What is the monthly rent in the Old Oak one?
So it starts at about £900 a month, and that includes your gas, electricity, internet, water, council tax, gym membership, So firstly, it is comparable to what you pay for a room. Secondly, you can't compare the quality of what you get. And thirdly, can you put a price on having the opportunity to meet like-minded people and potentially meet your future soulmate, right? And actually have actually have these amazing shared experiences, which is ultimately what we as a generation value, right? Things like that you can't put a price on. And so, we're sort of...
I appreciate it's a good product from those terms of view, that point of view, but I don't know if it's a sort of solution to affordability and affordable housing.
Reza hasn't said it is a solution to the affordable housing crisis in London. Please, I haven't said that Pocket is the solution to the affordable housing crisis. We are providers of a niche product which is going to work for some people. It's not going to work for everybody, and it's really important that we keep that pluralistic, varied view, because there is no one-size-fits-all solution.
We're meeting a need ultimately, right?
Well, somebody mentioned council housing, right? 25% of Westminster's housing is social rented housing.
25%.
25%. And that's, you excluded the right to buy, you've excluded, that second letting. It is socially rented at target rent, which is the lowest rent you can get in this country, 25% of Westminster. That's the bang in the middle of the capital city of this country. That isn't bad. That is not a bad statistic. You can't just call for more council housing. That is quite a decent amount. I think the problem is the other 75% doesn't go up in steps. It goes from there to there.
Because there's nothing
and
in the middle.
The bit in the middle is what we have to try and cover. These guys have got products that pick up some of the bit in the middle. We, I think, as a local authority, have the responsibility to look for more models for the bit in the middle. I mean, clearly the CLT is a fantastic model if you have a group of people wanting to do that. But, there's not a lot of land spare in Westminster, so it's not likely to be that answer. We have to fill that gap. But we don't need more council housing in Westminster, I would posit.
What about for the families that you're sending to Coventry? Wouldn't it be useful to have more council housing for them?
No, it wouldn't. I'm not sending anybody to Coventry. Guardian, I hope somebody read beyond the very cheap headline that I was amazed the Guardian would use, because underneath that very cheap headline was a very balanced article. And it was an article which is about openly and transparently starting the debate about being able to afford to live in London. And we are suggesting that we are going to move people to within an hour of Westminster and not out of the home counties. Despite the lovely Send to Coventry headline, it's not a murmur of that, and we will not do that. Which is something that every London borough is doing and not talking about it. And I would rather talk about it. I'd rather talk about it. I'd rather find a transparent and reasonable way to do it through supported housing than do it quietly and, dump. The one last thing for me is I really hate the stigma that now even the Guardian seems to be attaching to homeless families. Right, homeless families are people who need to live somewhere in a home they can afford, and they move around the country. And this idea that they are not welcome in a borough when they are an ordinary family that moves into an ordinary house and pays council tax, I find really difficult that is how we frame the debate. And I think deeply disappointing, Owen, that you framed it
I'll tell my
in that
colleague
way.
off. It wasn't one of my articles. I hasten to add.
I have met your colleague.
Karim, did you want the final word?
I just wanted to go back to the earlier question about the bigger kind of political question. I think it's really difficult to have these kind of talks about really thinking about that, the big picture. And I think there is a real desperate need for something radical and new to emerge. And my attitude has always been I don't really see the market or the state really solving this. And I really feel like the civil sector needs to take a lead and use those worlds and the rules they work in as a tool and work within that. But we really need to be in control, and because we haven't been. I think that's the big cultural question. We haven't been. We're just used to just kind of being subjugated to what there is, but we haven't really been challenging it in an effective way. And I think the CLT movement, mutual shared ownership, cooperative, is a way we can organise ourselves. And I think the bigger question about, you've got this problems with attitudes towards migration, immigrants, and the national agenda is seriously depressing right now. I find I have to stop reading the news now. And I think seriously, like all of you in this room, like we have to become the leaders of building a new, whether it's housing, whether it's energy, whether it's schools, whatever. And what I would say is we don't have to do it in an adversarial way, because on the journey I've gone with Russ, I've realised a lot of people in the council, within the political sphere, we can all the big evil politicians, blah, blah, but when I sit down and meet them, they're just normal people serving the community, trying to do a good job. They're under-resourced, they're desperate, haven't got enough staff to do what they're trying to do. And actually, if you go to them organising with a good idea, they'll probably want to listen to you. And I think we need to change our attitude, not trying to fight these people. And actually, okay, there might be some bad apples out there, but the ones I've met, they're just like me and you, they want to do a good job. So I think this new thing, whatever it is, however it emerges, needs to organise itself open-minded and about collaboration.
Time
and
to
I
get
think we need
organised.
to do it.
And where better to organise than in the bar? Yeah, thanks to all of our panel. Thank you all for coming. And hope to see you next week for the planning debate. There will be more tickets released for the rest of the series, so don't fret if it says sold out. Thanks.